I will not knowingly say anything which I know to be untruthful. There may be things that I think maybe aren't that beneficial to the war effort, and so I won't put them as a centerpiece. And there are certain things you might hear, and you think, actually, either for encouraging people to support Ukraine or the war effort, this just might not be helpful, or it might actually be unhelpful. And if I've said something and information comes to light that maybe that wasn't accurate, or then I'll definitely address that and talk about it. So I in doing this, I come to realize that there are many journalists who have that same compulsion. But I've come to realize also there are many journalists who put themselves at the center of the story, and indeed the medium itself. Well, the medium itself is not designed or structured to reflect reality. It is designed almost algorithmically to gain people's attention. And therefore there are choices, and those choices often are not based on an objective analysis of what is important and what isn't objectively important. It's based on, yeah, this is important, but will it sell copy? Will it gain attention? Yeah. Will it, And I see that as a fundamental flaw. So individual journalists can talk about their sort of probity, and yet they're always at the whim of this machine and this methodology. And they're delighted when they get a story done, but it may be only, 1 in 10 of the stories they'd like to write actually come to attention. Whereas I wake up every day and think, what am I going to talk about? What's important? What's going to have an impact? What's truthful? Nobody tells me what to cover. And I rather like that.
Hello and welcome. Our guest this week is Jonathan Fink, who also has a channel here talking about this conflict. It's called Silicon Curtain, and very much like us here at On the Edge, Jonathan speaks with all sorts of different guests on a wide range of topics, but all primarily discussing Ukraine. So we share our thoughts on what we've been reporting about, but additionally, we talk about why it is that it's increasingly independents who have to be the ones to keep talking about what is happening here, and why more traditional forms of information sources seem to be not doing quite the job that you would expect of them normally. Additionally, also, let me take that opportunity to segue into saying, if you like what you're about to see, if you like the content that we're putting out, not only here, but over at Silicon Curtain, then please do click the the subscribe button, and if you'd be so kind, leave some sort of comment. It does seem to attract the algorithm a little bit more if you do, and at the end of the day, spreading the message and gaining a wider audience for everybody who is involved in this cause, to remember what is happening here and why it is so important, and to counter Moscow's narrative. That is our goal. So, Jonathan Fink, sir, thank you so very much for joining us. It's a real pleasure, and it always is, to speak with you and collaborate with you. But for my audience who may not, on the off chance, know about you, why did you create Silicon Curtain? And by the way, why did you decide to call it Silicon Curtain?
No, I thought you'd get to that one. That's usually the question that way around. I explained this the other day to someone who's an expert on, let's say, sort of Russian digital propaganda, cognitive warfare operations. And that's the kind of basis of it. Is like we had the Iron Curtain, and to an extent, the lies, yes, they could be propagated through analysts and newspapers and so on, but the mediums for Russian propaganda, there were fewer opportunities, and actually the way they tried to propagandize communist, either ideology or to undermine the West, it wasn't effective for a variety of means or reasons. One of those was the medium. Now, however, we have propaganda piped into our digital devices. And it's not so that's the name. It's basically, the Iron Curtain is now everywhere. It's in everyone's bedroom, bathroom, on the street, on the bus, on the train. So that's the idea behind that. But it's more insidious than that, because in the era, as you know, as we were discussing how old we are, from the era of mass communications, it is sort of more difficult for Russians to segment their audience and pump those into the medium. Everything is more monolithic back in the good old days, and that certainly made it more difficult for the Soviet Union to get its message across. Not impossible. Now, of course, using digital technology, and if you have a malign entity that is quite happy to use any narrative and adapt that narrative to a particular audience, then we're in a whole world of pain. Because you won't even necessarily, we can see the obvious propaganda here because it's the stuff aimed at us, and it may or may not work. And if it doesn't work, hey, we're clever because we've spotted it. We don't spot how that message is being segmented to a variety of audiences, packaged up. We don't even spot the propaganda that works on us. We only spot the stuff that doesn't work. So it's a kind of long story. But kind of short story long. That's
well. I mean, it is similar in so many different ways to the shift that happened, say, in the Second World War, when you had to contend with radio as a new medium that was used both by the Allied forces. You think of Franklin Delano Roosevelt doing his fireside chats, but then you also have Adolf Hitler, broadcasting to all the fascist Axis, and I see the similarity in this revolutionary new form of, both producing and consuming information. To jump ahead a little bit, we'll bounce around a little bit, but since we're talking about this particular aspect of it, what have you seen out there that is messing with people's minds? The misconceptions, the disinformation, the information warfare campaign, which you and I are active participants in because, of course, we both put out content. What have you seen on the other side of the equation, the Russian disinformation warfare campaign?
I mean, let's tackle some of those narratives, because it's not always true to say that Russian narratives are an alien thing. In fact, propaganda works well when it aligns with or works with the grain of the wood, i.e. with the problems that we've already got. So actually the most effective propaganda is the one that really sort of wheedles its way into issues and voices that we've already got within our societies. It just pours petrol on those flames. But to tackle, something you just said there, I always go back to, let's say, H.G. Wells's famous broadcast, which caused panic, the dramatized version of War of the Worlds, as a news broadcast. But that's
Orson Welles.
It's a fantastic example of the power of radio, but it's also indicative that, one, there weren't really the restrictions. I mean, restrictions came in after that to say, hang on a second, you can't cause mass panic by blurring the formats, right? Let's have genres. Let's clearly define what they are, and certain things are allowed and certain things aren't. So you have the development of, I would say, sort of governmental regulations, controls, editorial controls. You also have the development of a culture of people becoming a bit more savvy, understanding the medium, the formats, and bringing a degree of dare I say it, cynicism and indifference to the formats, which means they're less effective for that purpose. We're, I think, at the early stages of the internet age where, one, we do not have regulation, and in fact we can come to that because this is an interesting case in history here with the decline of the nation state and the feeling that you cannot control digital media, and that's the root of some of the authoritarian slide that we're seeing now is the abdication of its responsibility to legislate and control by the state. You also have the absence of culture, the absence of a culture of cynicism and being able to sort of parse this information, understand the mechanisms by which people are trying to manipulate you. And it took a long time, if the television age had come in the 1930s, that perhaps would have caused the kind of bombshell we're seeing now, but it didn't. It came in a relatively peaceful post-war era. We had decades to get used to that medium, and it happened in a period where government controls were strong, and people were very grounded in reality. Many people who really started, watching television were either the parents of or actual participants in the Second World War. So that grounding in reality, which I think is an important part of being able to see through propaganda. So the television revolution was a revolution, but it wasn't as malign as we're seeing now. This is also aligned, I think, now, and this I will come to the narratives. It's aligned with a group of not just oligarch-funded, but sort of oligarch-aligned libertarianism, which says that you cannot legislate this stuff. So actually some of the most effective Russian propaganda at this time is the ones that align with the sort of libertarian idea that your freedoms are under threat, that you cannot legislate, that you cannot restrict, that identity is under threat from malign forces of the left, etc., etc. So it jumped on things that are happening, but it also contains within it a sort of almost self-protection that stops us sort of legislating against this malign influence. Now, Ukraine is under, let's say, an existential struggle. It does not; those libertarian arguments do not make really as much sense to Ukrainians as they do to us, because they have a far starker choice, which means, I think, that they're approaching the internet age a little bit like we approach the television age, rooted in a kind of reality that says, okay, we're not going to just allow this stuff to degrade all the bonds in our society, to divide us to the point of being unable to defend against threats. This is the point of propaganda, though. It is there to disarm you and divide you so that when the conqueror, when the aggressor comes, you have nothing. Not only do you necessarily physically armed, but you no longer have the will to fight and resist. You may even be arguing amongst yourselves about who the aggressor and who the victim actually is.
And the Russians are historically and famously known for psychological kind of war, even going back to like the concept of a Potemkin village. If you can control the perception of reality, and the Russians do this very, very well. I mean, it is you mentioned there kind of the idea of divide and conquer. If you don't have a common reality, as I said, the Russians are so good at this. I mean, how has it been for you as a content creator and someone who wants to get the truth out there? How has it been for you to push back against this tide? Because they're good at it.
They're good at it, and it's not there just to. In fact, the main purpose isn't to get people to get really angry about this and that, to take action. The main impulse here is to try and force you to have indifference or develop a sort of nihilistic attitude. Yes, they want people to fight amongst themselves, but ultimately they want you to not take action and to not see problems as solvable. In that sense, I think it's highly, highly effective. Even the old trope about NATO expansion as opposed to NATO enlargement, NATO being this sort of aggressive, offensive organization that's swallowed up half of Europe, and is encircling Russia. That stuff is. I'm still shocked day in, day out how many people have just internalized that. Not because they thought about it and it makes sense. It's precisely because they haven't thought about it but it percolates through. It's the act of repetition. This might be offensive to some people, and I don't mean to say that it is a religion, but they use the techniques of religions, which is the repetition of, say, catechisms and phrases. And in the sense of church, it's because people fundamentally, they understand that if you want people to behave in a certain way, and some of the church stuff, of course, is inclined towards morality and certain behavioral rules. They know that you have to repeat it ad nauseum. You have to repeat it every week, every day, even day in, day out. And you have to turn it into a slogan or a phrase. You have to program it into people's brains. So at that critical moment of, dare I say it, sort of moral, threat of moral turpitude or whatever, this phrase can come back to your mind and maybe prevent you from going there. Or if you actually have, transgressed, you have this sense that you've crossed the line and you're aware of what you're doing. But it's the repetition of these phrases that religion has realized is so important. I think this is, Russia has realized this very early on, that you have to not treat people as rational beings, and you have to create stories, brainworms, for them. And they don't have to be coherent. You just have to be coherent to that individual at that point in time. They don't have to be, let's say, sort of universally coherent and logical. But repetition is the big thing.
Repetition is the big thing, but also they study in particular the kind of Anglo-American Western culture. That they're particularly concerned. They have this long-standing beef with the British, but they also see the Americans as their primary enemy, and they focus on our fault lines. So they will exacerbate racial tensions. They will exacerbate class tension, and then of course, playing upon the LGBTQ kind of thing as well. So, as a fellow student and follower and observer of Russia, I wonder if you could chime in a little bit about how they do focus on our fault lines, and they do propagandize and weaponize even immigration. Obviously, they will weaponize all sorts of things. I wonder if you could touch upon how you've seen it, this information warfare, and how they're weaponizing these cracks and fault lines.
One of the primary aims of it lately, and of course, I think the main theatre of it, of course, has been with Trump and the theatre of the Oval Office. Yes, you want to divide and conquer. You don't want allies to support Ukraine with the provision of munitions. So you use a number of different things. One, you try and get sort of Zelensky to sort of have confrontations with Trump, and you want this sort of theatre of division to take place. And there's been some success there, and one can argue as to whether Russia triggered that or whether these are processes that are playing out anyway, or whether they're fostered by assets and agents or people who are deeply inculcated in Russian narratives. It's probably a mixture of all of those. But that's not all of it. You also want the public in the US and Europe to think that their own problems, their own economic problems, are more important than Ukrainians being slaughtered, quite frankly. Price of eggs, price of bread, price of meat, all this kind of stuff, price of energy, fuel bills. And you want to place inside people's minds that, yes, you can have some sympathy, but ultimately you need to put your interests first. Strategically, of course, that doesn't make sense because all these price increases, fundamentally, many of them are caused by, there are multiple causes, but one of the big causes, of course, is the fact that Russia decided to initiate a war, the largest war at scale, conventional war, since the Second World War. That spiked energy and food prices around the world and continues to do so. The fact they're engaging in hybrid operations around the world is increasing the price of logistics. The fact they are stoking division and trying to get China decoupled from its trading partners in the West. I mean, this has absolutely been Russia's initiative since, forever, but since 2008 and the financial crisis. They've been dreaming of the day they could persuade China to throw over its broader economic interest in collaborating with the West, and side in some, monstrous adventure in autocracy. They don't even sort of hide it. So a lot of the narratives there are to try to dissuade people from taking action, as well as to stoke sort of division. And we see these resurfacing, and they will continue to resurface over and over. We've got that resurfacing Germany with the AfD and that rise. Mm-hmm. We've got Farage, who is channeling a kind of Britain first, othering and using immigration and so on as an extremely divisive. I mean, that's the only issue really he's campaigning on. Mm-hmm. All the other things that he intends to do, looking at his policies, are deeply unpopular and would be deeply unpopular with the British public if he was explicit and transparent about them. Increasing oligarch business interests, reducing the state element of the NHS, if not completely doing it away. I mean, he is on a completely Trumpian crusade. We would have Doge-type activities to dismantle what Britain is relatively famous for, which is reasonable governance and a professional class of civil servants. He would start tearing that to pieces. No doubt. I have no doubt in my mind whatsoever that's a core part of his, his program. But he can't talk about these openly because they're not particularly popular and they aren't going to work particularly well. But the immigration stuff works. And there we see one of Russia's physical, not just informational campaigns. And this has been its objective, I think, since it helped to sort of stoke the war and scale up the war in Syria, is to weaponize immigration, to try to pump immigrants into Europe, to destabilize it politically and cause a lurch to the political populist right, which is a trend that we see all around. And it's people will see, yes, but it's a byproduct globalization. It's this. It's natural. I think while we consider many of our problems to be just sort of natural causes that we have to react against, we will fail to see that there is a degree of malignancy behind quite a lot of it.
Absolutely. And I always point back to 2015 when then Supreme Allied Commander Europe, General Philip Breedlove, came out with a report in which NATO had done, a deep dive and kind of analysis of the fact that Russia is weaponizing migration. And we do see these ties, and whether it's just common talking points or whether or not there is direct interaction. I mean, we have even things like Tulsi Gabbard saying that she gets all of her information, or used to, from RT, Russia Today, or the ties that Farage has to Russian oligarchy in London. We see Russian ties everywhere where these kind of disinformation and kind of the destabilization issues that you were just discussing there. But then if you say it, you're seen as a conspiracy theorist, because they've done a very good job of obscuring their direct ties and influence. Where do you see Russia's direct interaction in our democracies? I mean, be it Farage, be it Trump, be it Le Pen.
Well, we have to stick to facts, certainly, or what's known or in the public sphere. We don't want to get our
which is why they do it in the shadows. Which is why they do it in the shadows. Yeah.
And of course, those who are potentially connected to Russia have access, I think, to funds that allow them to litigate, and they are indeed extremely litigious. So we have to be quite careful. But one of Farage's key lieutenants, Nathan Gill, has recently been prosecuted for taking money for propagating Russian narratives. And it is not libelous to suggest that Farage was repeating and amplifying many of those very same narratives at the same time that he was. And
Is it just
they're
common? Do you think it's just common, a fellow traveler, or do you think there's somebody from the GRU, the Russian military intelligence, who is having a pint with good old Nigel somewhere and
well,
saying, you know what,
in the
this is
case
a
of
good
Nathan
talking point?
Gill, it's absolutely the case because
Yeah.
I haven't got the facts and figures in front of me, but he also worked with one of Ukraine's key oligarchs. I think it might even be Medvedchuk. I need to look that up because I had that in an interview with Peter Jukes. So there is a direct and demonstrable connection between Russian assets and part of their influence network and key political tools in, say, Ukraine, and this guy Nathan Gill, and it's been proven that he accepted money to propagate narratives. So I would have no doubt at all that that just doesn't happen accidentally, that that would be considered a fairly high-level activity, therefore it has a degree of planning and communication connection. So yes, I would absolutely say so. The fact of his proximity to Nigel Farage over an extensive period of time, I think people have to draw their own inferences from that. I would not be surprised if more connections came to light. Peter Jukes has also written an article, and Carol Codwell is writing extensively on this, about Aaron Banks, who was one of the key financial figures in Leave.e, the Leave campaign around the Brexit referendum. He is alleged to have made numerous visits to the Russian embassy prior to and during the Brexit campaign. Again, people can draw their own conclusions. Maybe he just liked maybe they're just generous people and they just invited him for lunch and a chat about Tolstoy and whatever, Tolstoyevsky. Somehow I doubt it. They are not generous people and they would not do something unless, and this is an extremely high level connection here. So I think we see the outlines, we see the sort of the traces, as it were, of these connections, but many more of them need to come to light and be researched and propagated. But there's been a singular lack of attention and interest in the British media to these connections, which I find disturbing. And yet, Farage is dare I say it, he farts and they'll broadcast it on the BBC.
Yeah.
He has, excuse the language, he has 5 MPs. He is marginal in the extreme in terms of his presence in Parliament, but it's this monster that almost creates itself. And because of the coverage, the polls are now moving heavily in his favour, and yet the allegations of corruption, the allegations of impropriety are really not publicised. The demonstrable connection with people who have accepted largesse from the Kremlin is not explored. The fact that Nigel Farage appeared numerous times on Russia Today and would have been paid, one would assume, not insignificant sums of money for doing so. None of this really seems to have any bearing, apparently, on our situation, and yet, to my mind, it has all the bearing in the world, because one of Farage's first acts will be to withdraw support for Ukraine, and we know that Britain has been crucial in stiffening the spine of many European countries, especially Central and Western European. If Britain were to go floppy, let's say, then I think we will also observe a very rubbery spine in many European countries, not the Baltics and the Nordics necessarily, because they already, I think, have a degree of concern about their ally, Britain, in that respect, and our underinvestment in defence over the last couple of decades. But no, it's widely recognised, I think, that Britain is a key player in Ukraine, with significant assets, dare I say it, involved, skin in the game, and there's a serious risk of that being dismantled. Farage, again, would not have to be or would not be open about it. He wouldn't come out and say, do you know what, this is over. I think he would just deconstruct it in the background and focus just on, weaponizing the debate around migrants and talking about Britain first and all this kind of stuff and picking fights with people. It's the old Trumpian smoke and mirrors, distract them with the noise and the fire hose of falsehood and, tearing down parts of your heritage while, which is important nonetheless, but it distracts you from the vast amount of iniquity that's going on just below the radar.
I couldn't agree more. And, additionally, I mean, like we see it in the States with the Tenet media controversy, where it was shown that the Kremlin was funneling vast, sums to primarily kind of your right-wing anti-establishment, libertarian kind of content producers. So on their side, they have a very orchestrated, purposeful program utilizing the freedom of speech and, figures in our cultures and societies that would speak to that audience that would then, cause these rifts. On our side, however, Jonathan, we all seem to be doing it. We collaborate. You and I have collaborated in the past. There are channels out there. Obviously, after you're done watching On the Edge and Silicon Curtain, there are certainly some other folks out there. Luke Bro, for example.
Jake Bro.
Jake Bro, not Luke. Jake Bro. Or there's a few of them. Do you consume content from other producers? And why do you think it is that we're all kind of in a loose movement pushing back against Russia's information warfare campaign? But what do you think about the folks on our side? Is there anybody that you're particularly
cheeky question there? Because people will be offended if I don't.
I know. I'm asking you to put yourself right in in front of a bus. Let's not say favorites, but let's just say, are there folks out there that you recommend our mutual audiences would benefit?
I'll start with a slightly less contentious one, which is, who I really get a lot of energy from speaking with and doing these kind of conversations. There's you, of course. We have to say that, a generous host. But someone I really enjoy speaking to is D.W. Phillips, who is a pro-Ukraine activist, but also a constitutional lawyer in the US. So he has, and he's also fascinated by the history of the Second World War. So you have this sort of conjunction there of expertise and passion, which is always compelling for me. That's not necessarily what's most compelling for the audience. Because I do this day in, day out, I'm always looking for something that is going to thrill me, that I've not heard before, that's going to push the boundaries of my understanding. That's not necessarily what all the audience are in it for, and they might find that stuff a little heavy going. But I think D.W. Phillips is fantastic. I listen to a lot of what Vlad Vixler does. So he's not going to have, he hasn't got as I don't, the size and scale of audience that Jake Bro does, but he does have a significant audience and a very, very loyal one. And one which is perhaps a little more, academic in its leanings, but he's got that deep, I would say, grounding in political philosophy and the history of Russia, which I think is really interesting to. So I watch a lot of his material because I don't get the opportunity to speak to him very often. I enjoy Mr. Jonathan Pierce. I enjoy speaking to him. I can't watch all his stuff because he will broadcast about 6 hours of material a day. Well done, Jonathan. It's all good stuff, but it's just life is too short for that. I'll be honest that I do dip into everyone in the field, and that includes Anna Danilchuk, or Predostarsky, Jake Bro. I will actually pick up and watch quite a bit of his stuff, especially if it's on a particular topic. I'll listen to Greg Terry because I think his sort of dare I say it, is it evangelical Presbyterian? Anyway, he's sort of, let's say, American
Baptist or
Baptist minister, isn't he? Yeah. So
Yeah, I
that
think he's
background
got
is
the-
fascinating for me because
Yeah.
it's just so completely different from my. But he'll have crucial information. He's a very empathetic individual. So this is crucial information about how certain narratives are going to play, and how he packages it up is for people who come from that community, especially. That's just fascinating. But the majority of my time, and then I've admitted this before, I'll listen to a couple of broadcasters in Russian. So that'll be a few ethnic Russian, so-called dissident media. I'm very selective. Before people go like, there are a few who are tremendously good, and there are a lot who are. I don't have time to watch stuff that's average or stuff that's 50% right or 80% right. I need information that is concentrated and reliable all the time, as close to 100% as I can get it, simply because I don't have that much time. And I found that listening to a couple of commentators such as Vitaly Portnikov, who's a Ukrainian journalist, a broadcaster in Russian, listening to Michael Naki, who's an ethnic Russian, so I would say dissident journalist, just the information. If I listen to half an hour or an hour of their material, I would have to listen to 20 or 30 hours of English language material to get the same value, with an awful lot of hard work to sift the, let's say the prejudice and the accuracy out of. So I just go to the sources that are concentrated and I can trust.
Yeah, and sadly, unfortunately, our traditional journalists and news organizations just don't seem to be putting in the time or the effort. I mean, I've been hypercritical of my former industry, not necessarily the journalists on the ground. They're trying to do, for the most part, the best job that they can. But it seems that our traditional sources of information have all but kind of put Ukraine on the back burner, which is incredibly frustrating to me. And I don't know if you have felt the same way about the information flow.
They absolutely have, and I think there's a couple of problems there. I mean, one is that there's probably always been a tendency to do this. It's just that we're engaged in this particular story, therefore we're aggrieved that it's not covered more. But if I've said this before, if this was the 1990s, then this story would have greater prominence than it does now. You would have a lot more resource thrown into it. If you look back at the Korean War, if you look back at the Gulf Wars, and even Afghanistan, there was a lot more coverage of an in-depth coverage of what's going on. So I think we have a certain conjunction here, which is the broad public is detaching a bit from geopolitics and only latching on to a small number of stories which fill their headspace with trauma. Gaza being a particular one. And there's, dare I say it, people aren't going to like this, there's an intense amount of hypocrisy there. Because did they pay attention to the slaughter in Syria, which arguably was on a far greater scale and against Muslims and a European country meddling directly, which was Russia? No, they barely paid it any attention. So I think we see an extreme politicization of the news. We see an extreme need for people to, let's say it's an extension of identity politics. They're turning geopolitics and news into something that is a component of their identity. And to an extent, let's say the pro-Ukraine bubble are doing that as well. But that's part of a wider trend that people, I think, are perhaps have less empathy. And therefore, to really, gain their attention, you have to intimately link these stories with identity. But also, you're dealing with declining business models. So we see this on YouTube. YouTube, since I started, has always been, I would say, an algorithm. It's not as bad as Twitter, of course. Twitter was fine when I started, and then Musk took it over. Twitter has become a sewer of disinformation, but also the algorithms are weighted based on political standpoints and identity standpoints. So it's an extremely deviant platform, I would say. YouTube, I don't think, has a sort of identity or political biases built in it. It has standard editorial censorship and triggers, but that's fine. Those are the rules that it sets. and I think it's okay. But what it does do is it biases its algorithm towards extreme recency and extremely emotive behavior. So I think we're in a kind of feedback loop here of declining empathy, declining mainstream formats, declining ability of people to think in an analytical sense. And not only are social media platforms reflecting those changes in their algorithms, they're accelerating those changes by then serving material up that actually increases those kind of biases. So people want stuff that's happening right now. They want it to be short, punchy. They only will pay attention if it's got highly emotive, really extreme sort of, clickbait headlines. And I've been doing experiments on my channel, and the algorithm changed a couple of weeks ago, and it got far, far worse. So let's say, and you can say that, there are differences in thumbnail and timing's important, all these kind of things. Of course, there's going to be a variety of factors. But I noticed consistently that interviews that would be getting, say, 50,000, 100,000 views last year, and, in aggregate, all other, factors are the same, similar thumbnails, titles, etc. They're getting sort of 3-5 times fewer views now than they were before. Whereas if I'll put out short, punchy news items, which I've started to do a lot more of, they will work okay if I give them let's say, a reasonable descriptive title, but they will only break through. They will only achieve a larger audience, above the sort of, and for the news items, it's getting up into the tens of thousands. They will only achieve that if I use extremely emotive language and at the same time tap into something that is happening right now. So they're all being driven by this, I call it sort of recency and rage bias.
Yeah. The clickbait issue and the algorithm issue is a real a problematic thing that I suspect we and all of us in this space kind of combat against. I'm not going to take up too much more of your time, so I've just got a couple more questions here. But when we talk about, just to follow on from what you were just saying there, is there a narrative that you see out there that you are particularly dedicated to countering? I know that's a very large question to ask, but are there the as I say, the narratives, the kind of the propaganda that is put out by the Russians to attack the West, to attack Ukraine? Is there something out there that you see that you're particularly determined to push back against?
Yes, the one that's absolutely consistent and has been, propagated since 2014. Well, earlier than that, but really it's scaled up in 2014. Is this idea that somehow Russian speakers in the East needed to be rescued, and that they are ethnic Russian. And the reason why I keep harping on about this one is because it's so ludicrous. I speak Russian, so does that mean that this small corner of Oxfordshire is going to be annexed? I mean, it's ludicrous. You're speaking Russian. No, sorry, you're not speaking Russian. You're speaking English, but, you're born in the States. Does that make you English? And of course it doesn't. It's the same with Ireland. No. My ancestors are from Ireland. If I studied in Scotland at university, you make the mistake of calling someone English just based on their linguistic profile. You're not going to last long in certain places.
I think you'll find if you were to wander down to St. Stephen's Green off Grafton Street in Dublin and proclaim that someone in the pub is English, I think an Irishman or woman would might take a slight umbrage at that.
Yeah,
I always kind of
even the wrong corners of Edinburgh, which is a genteel city, is going to get you in a degree of trouble if you make that mistake.
Or Glaswegians, of course, famously as well. You'll get the Glaswegian kiss.
I
agree with you 100%.
It's absurd.
I agree with you 100%. The idea that simply because the people out in the Donbass, and also it's part of their colonization. For myself, that's one of the things that I keep trying to emphasize to my audience is that this is an imperial war. It's a war of colonization. Ukraine is not Russia. Anybody who has been to both places can tell you that. I mean, you have a history with Russia and with Ukraine. I mean, you must also see the differences between these two peoples. Would you agree with me that the message that this is a war of colonization is
100%
amongst the myriad issues to discuss?
I would say it
keep trying to
started as a
deliver to
war
my
of
audience.
colonization because I think the Russian regime convinced itself of its own propaganda that people would either be indifferent and not really care who they're ruled by, or they would welcome them, with bread and salt. They certainly knew that wasn't the case if they go into Western Ukraine, but I think they actually fervently believed that everything up into Kiev and Odessa is fair enough. We're just going to walk in and it'll all be a picnic. They actually believe this. But it's gone from being what would have been, I think, termed a colonial war at this point. Once they realised that actually almost no one is going to behave in that way and almost no one is going to welcome them. And actually, the core ranks of resistance against their invasion is going to come from Russian-speaking Ukrainians. You go to the trenches, people aren't so fussed about whether you speak Russian or Ukrainian. Or at least I haven't been in the trenches, to be clear, but I've spoken to many people who are. People might not speak to you in Russian in Lviv, but if you need it to communicate, the closer you get east, they're not going to care. They're just going to communicate in a way that hampers the Russians' desire to control them and eradicate them, it's whatever.
And also certainly culturally as well. I mean, I see there is the desire for the rule of law. There is the desire for democracy and freedom of press and freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. All of these things are important to Ukrainians, whereas certainly you can't paint with a massive broad brush, but in Russia these things are not necessarily as important as
they're
they
not.
are.
And of course, people might say, and I had this impression as well, is when you go east, there are certain physical characteristics that do come to resemble Russian villages and cities a bit more, and that's inescapable. But to draw the conclusion from that because these people are speaking Russian, because there are some similarities in architecture and village layouts and materials and whatever, that somehow they are, again, it is entirely ludicrous. I mean, Dublin has 18th century brick buildings, not dissimilar from parts of Georgian London. Doesn't make it an English city. The fact that at some point maybe there was commonality in professions and an export in design, or people copied designs or whatever. The whole thing is ludicrous and simplistic. But what annoys me is you have people who aren't Russian agents fall into this trap continuously because the environment is seeded by so many people who are assets and agents of the Kremlin, such as Jeffrey Sachs, who came out with this just yesterday, talking about ethnic Russians in the Donbass. He doesn't know what he's talking about, or rather he knows what he's talking about, but twists the reality because he's being paid to do so. It's kind of grotesque. Tucker Carlson probably says these things half out of ignorance as well as complicity. But this is the one to push back on because it is the big, absurd lie at the centre of all of this. Now, however, it's no longer a colonial war, it's a war of eradication. Now they realise that they cannot control these people, they cannot reprogram them without considerable effort and expenditure of resources. And they've realised that they can only really do it with children. That's why they kidnapped so many. And even then, it's not particularly easy. They've realised that eradication is the only way to do it, and the recolonisation of those territories with ethnic Russians and those from Central Asia to be used as sort of, slave workers. So it's a war of eradication now, not colonisation, I would say.
Well said. Well said. You mentioned our mutual friend Greg Terry. We've spoken about Jake Bro. I'm sure that all the other folks that we've spoken about in our conversation equally also. do things like the project that both you and I share, which is fundraising for vehicles. We were both involved in the Cars for Ukraine campaign, and proud to be. So how important is it for you not only to be engaged in the information warfare campaign, but to do something tangible, to actually fundraise and do active measures to support
Active
Ukraine?
measures, yes, a good phrase.
Well, it is, because at the end of the day, back when I was employed as a journalist, had I openly campaigned for one side of an issue or another, I would be chastised. It would be seen as unethical. But
Same as academics, previously academics would have been,
sure.
It's getting your hands too dirty. Yeah.
Yes. But as independent actors, and by the way, I'll just take this opportunity, if you haven't already, do either through Jonathan's channel or here at On the Edge, support for Cars for Ukraine. It's a good and righteous cause. But how important is it to you to not only speak, but to be involved fundamentally in the war effort?
I mean, I don't claim to be a journalist, even though I do claim to be trying.
Good for you. They're awful people.
No, it's because I want to be upfront that this is activism. Because I'm focusing not on all the world's geopolitical problems, I'm focusing on this one, and this is the lens through which I see the world. And I have a particular purpose, and that purpose is clearly stated, and that is to see the end of Russian imperialism and indeed the collapse of that entity, as Russia as an imperial entity. This is something I've felt for a long time, decades, would be beneficial to the Russian people if somehow, local identities and a Russian national identity not based on an imperial project were to emerge. So I'm quite clear that this is a motivation, and journalists may share that desire, but they can't be, explicit, or they can't bake it into their activities. I know many journalists who would wholeheartedly agree that this is a desirable thing, but that they try to disengage their work from that. Having said that, and this is going to sound a little perverse, maybe it doesn't to you, I'm relatively obsessed with trying to be truthful. I will not knowingly say anything which I know to be untruthful. There may be things that I think maybe aren't that beneficial to the war effort, and so I won't put them as a centerpiece. And there are certain things you might hear, and you think, actually, either for encouraging people to support Ukraine or the war effort, this just might not be helpful, or it might actually be unhelpful because this information is not in the public domain, and it should remain, until people choose to put it there. Professionals in whatever the intelligence and military sphere, I don't want to get anyone in trouble or put anyone in harm's way. Whereas occasionally I get the impression that journalists are obsessive about, if they find out something that other people don't know, there's an obsession to sort of, okay, I'm duty bound to bring this to public attention. I don't feel that, but I do feel a sort of commitment to truthfulness, as it were. And if I've said something and information comes to light that maybe that wasn't accurate, or then I'll definitely address that and talk about it. So in doing this, I come to realize that there are many journalists who have that same compulsion. But I've come to realize also there are many journalists who put themselves at the center of the story, and indeed the medium itself. Well, the medium itself is not designed or structured to reflect reality. It is designed almost algorithmically to gain people's attention. And therefore there are choices, and those choices often are not based on an objective analysis of what is important and what isn't objectively important. It's based on, this is important, but will it sell copy? Will it gain attention? Will it, and I see that as a fundamental flaw. So individual journalists can talk about their sort of probity And yet they're always at the whim of this machine and this methodology. And they're delighted when they get a story done, but it may be only, 1 in 10 of the stories they'd like to write actually come to attention. Whereas I wake up every day and think, what am I going to talk about? What's important? What's going to have an impact? What's truthful? Nobody tells me what to cover. And I rather like that.
Well, as somebody who has seen how the sausage is made, you're spot on there. And unfortunately, it has become more about profit than informing the electorate. And so I appreciate your works. I'm going to continue to do what I'm doing. I am, like you, I am unabashedly pro-Ukrainian. Otherwise, I wouldn't live here. It'd be rather foolish. But also, I agree with you. I think, as the fantastic Professor Timothy Snyder puts it when he speaks about empire, is that at some point, all imperial states, for their own benefit, must lose an imperial war, because then they're forced to look in the mirror. And I think the Russians must do that at some point. Last question. I know you don't have a crystal ball. None of us do. We can project. We can make informed guesses and kind of make calculations. But just as we finish up here, what are your thoughts on where this war is going to go, with all the people that you speak to? And by the way, I'm openly and unabashedly envious of the wonderful guests that you have on your program. So well done, you. But having spoken to all of them on all different kinds of topics and areas of expertise, certainly you must have kind of formulated an idea of where you think this is all headed. Would you care to share your thoughts?
I mean, I articulated with Ben Hodges in the first year of the war, towards the end of the first year of the war, when we had our first conversation, the idea, and it hasn't really changed, that it's attritional, but it's an attritional struggle between two entities that have a lot of flaws and problems. And that is Ukraine plus its Western allies, let's say, and Russia, and their problems are different. But it's to see who crumbles first. It's not to see who almost triumphs first. It's to see which side falls apart soonest. And that remains the same. And Russia's efforts, almost throughout, have been to persuade or dissuade Ukraine's allies from giving them a significant, exceed some kind of threshold where they can overcome all of the weaknesses, where those systemic weaknesses in the Russian side become catastrophic. So I see this as being a balancing act almost from the start. Now, of course, Ukraine wouldn't survive without the extraordinary bravery and will of Ukrainians. The fact that even with the minimal weapons they had at their disposal, they've managed to do extraordinary things with it. So I'm not looking at Ukraine as necessarily being a weak entity. When you combine it with the Allied side, it seems that we've always given just enough to keep them balanced on that pivot of staying in the fight, never given them a threshold amount. And already in 2022, we were speculating as to whether there was design in that. And I think at that point, we concluded that maybe that was a little too cynical. As we went through 2023, I think it became clearer and clearer that actually this is by design. It's by design because certain narratives, back to our propagandistic thing, that Russia has propagated over decades, has actually worked. One is, we're a huge nuclear power, and we're crazy, and we're irrational. You don't want to piss us off. Don't poke the bear, because we're going to do crazy things. They're not crazy. I mean, they're crazy for expending so much men and material in pursuit of senseless objectives, but that's a byproduct of autocracy and autocratic hierarchy. It's not necessarily irrational in its own framework. So they've been very effective at using nuclear threat to prevent us from really uniting and giving Ukraine a threshold amount to allow them to win. If this wasn't the nuclear age, I think you would be seeing Ukraine thrash Russia, or would have seen them thrash Russia in the same way that Japan thrashed Russia in 1905, and then caused seismic cascading effects through that system. But no, everything has been held on a kind of pivot, almost intentionally. That is perhaps also from the Russian side, because Putin is not a great strategist. He's not a strategist at all. And he's also quite cautious. I mean, this is where I tend to find Mark Galeotti's views on this quite interesting. Putin is a coward, we know that, but he's also a strategic coward. And he's always undercommitted the strength of Russia and dribbled it out. So cumulatively, it's a huge cost. But he's never thrown, again, a threshold amount of resource at this problem, and he's misunderstood the nature of the problem or the enemy he's trying to tackle. So again, we've got this dynamic of who is going to be the last to crumble. And throughout this war, Russia has been getting weaker, I would say, but more malignant, and Ukraine has been getting stronger in many respects, technologically and organizationally. Just what it lacks is the people and the threshold amount of munitions to really hit Russia. And this still comes back, I think, to defending itself and surviving in the fight is all down to Ukraine. Winning and inflicting catastrophic defeat on Russia is very much down to the will and commitment of its allies. And unfortunately, I see this as carrying on in the same vein for a variety of reasons. So it will carry on until one side catastrophically collapses. And my money is on Russia being the one, but not the time frame. I can't tell you the time frame. I'm thinking.
I can't say the time frame either.
6 months to 18 months is what I've got in my head anyway.
Oh, okay, all right. I think that's entirely possible. I think both sides are exhausted. I know living here, speaking to Ukrainians are exhausted, but they do not see an alternative because they know what will happen if they lose. And as far as the Russians are concerned, my perspective is their two primary strategic goals, and that is to have a sycophantic or a pro-Moscow government in Kiev, and then the other strategic goal being regaining control of the northern shore of the Black Sea so that they can have their imperial naval aspirations with a warm water port. I don't think they're going to get either of those objectives. It's just not going to. So sadly, I'm afraid, Jonathan, it just means how many more people have to die before one side or the other decides that it's time to do something to draw this to a close. And I'm with you when it comes to. I think that needs to be Moscow.
The last phrase on that one is that Ukraine needs to bake that into its strategy. It partially has done that, but it's not fully. I think, internalize that, which is to trade land for Russian strength. It needs to, and I think they do, but it needs to understand that Putin will not stop. Therefore, every strategy should be geared towards preserving Ukrainian life and using, land as the bargaining chip to force Russia to attrit itself, because that's what it will do over and over and over again, irrationally in our perspective. But if you can build around that flaw, then I think Ukraine will win.
I agree with you, and I really don't see an alternative option for the Ukrainians. I mean, the Ukrainians, as has become the kind of the saying is, if Russia stops fighting, they just go home. If Ukraine stops fighting, there is no more Ukraine. So, Jonathan, I could speak with you, my good man, for hours and hours at a time. And if you'd ever like to have me back on Silicon Curtain, it would be absolutely my privilege to do so. You are always welcome here at any time as well. And once you have watched all of Jonathan's content on Silicon Curtain and all of my content on the Edge, there are a few others of us out there fighting the good fight, trying to get to keep Ukraine in people's minds. I know that we share that common goal. And so I appreciate very much.
I got
you
one
taking
last
the time
point.
out
I
of your
can't
day.
stop. I can't.
Yes.
I got one last quick point. I got
Yes, sir.
1 minute to my next.
We're always happy.
collision.
We're
Yes,
always
Russians
happy.
can go home. Yes, they can. But what Putin, I think, has realized relatively early on, what are they going to go home to? They're going to go home to a shattered economy, to people who have generally little but contempt for them and what they've done, who see them as criminals. Really, a lot of Russians will see people in the SVOs coming home not as heroes, but as people to be feared, as criminals. Putin knows that if these people come home, he's going to be met with a wave of catastrophic criminality and political destabilization, because some of them are nationalists, some of them are very angry with the way this war's being executed. This is the other reason why Putin can no longer stop, because he doesn't want them to come home. He cannot allow them to come home. He'll be faced with a position that the Soviet Union experienced after Afghanistan, but tenfold, 100-fold. He knows that'll be catastrophic. So I think we've got to bear that in mind too.
Yeah, he is the worst Russian leader in centuries, is my opinion. And so that's a good point to bring up, and I'm glad you included it. And as we close here, before we tempt the electrical outage gods here in Kiev, I will say thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure, as always, as it is always a pleasure to interact with you, Jonathan, and thank you for being on the edge this week with us.
I'm delighted to be invited. Thank you.